This is the video to submit your starting lineup with. Starting tier 1, you know these guys are in. Gibbs, Taylor, Cook, HN, Barkley, St. Brown, JSN, Jefferson. Columns, doesn't matter the matchups. Nothing matters here other than the fact that you put them in your lineup. Now, tier 2, maybe you would ask me a question about. Hopefully not. You should know you are starting Breece Hall this week. Specifically this week against the Dallas Cowboys, Breece Hall is set up in a smash spot. The implied team total for the Jets is about 22.5 points. Obviously, we're used to the Jets projecting out as one of the worst offenses in the league. It's just not going to be the case this week going up against one of the worst defenses in the league. And now that you have no Braylon Allen, we should expect the snap rate, the carry rate, and the receiving usage to be going up for Breece Hall as he now only has to compete with Isaiah Davis. So Breece is an absolute jam. Amari Hampton, also really exciting play. Playing Washington, 24.5 point implied team total for the Chargers. I would be more excited about Amari Hampton if it wasn't for the fact that you are now missing your two offensive tackles, which were some of the best tackles in the league. But Amari Hampton still this past week demonstrated that he can even get there as a receiver if the rushing attack isn't going to give him the volume, where you only had 12 carries, but the big plays were there, and at the same time, you had 37 receiving yards off of 5 receptions, giving you that floor. Javonte Williams will be our next running back. You do have Miles Sanders banged up, so I know some people are talking about Jaden Blue. The reality of the situation is Javonte's probably just going to see 80% of the snaps like you saw last week against the Green Bay Packers, but this is a much better matchup going up against the New York Jets, where the Dallas Cowboys aren't going to be favored in many games this year, but they are favored against the Jets in this one. And then our next option will be George Pickens in this same game. Yes, we want to be starting as many of these players that we can. With no CeeDee Lamb, Pickens is just going to continue to dominate target volume. He had 11 targets this past week, a team target share up at about 29% according to flockfantasy.com. His yards per route run were also up at 3.53. That was in a really tough matchup we actually saw against the New York Jets last week. Tyreek Hill was trending to have himself a fine day until obviously we know he got hurt. Garrett Wilson will also just be an absolute jam. Here are the target share numbers by Garrett Wilson per week. 43%, 38%, 37%, 29%. He is everything in this Jets passing offense, and this is a really strong matchup going up against the Dallas Cowboys. Jamar Chase will be our next name. Now, I know everybody is going to lose their mind, and I feel like I'm losing mine, because after week 2, when Jamar dropped 36.5 points, and I plummeted him in our rankings, no longer being the number 1 asset in fantasy, saying, I know we look good with Jake Browning this 1 week, but the offense is going to be much, much worse than it would be with Joe Burrow going forward. People screamed at me about that. Hindsight being 2020 was crazy. And now people are screaming at me at the other end, because Jamar Chase over the past 2 weeks is averaging about 8.5 fantasy points per game. The Cincinnati Bengals have been horrendous. And I'm looking at Jamar Chase going, well, you know what? He's had 10 receptions over the past 2 weeks. This is an offense that's going to bounce back. While, yes, they've looked like the worst offense in the league, you watched them on prime time, so that's just in your head, and that's what you're thinking about. The Detroit Lions-Cincinnati Bengals game is supposed to be like the highest scoring game of the week. You have an implied team total of almost 20 points here for the Bengals. Like, sportsbooks are telling us that the Bengals project to score 1 fewer point than the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So this is an all-time buy low moment on Jamar Chase. If you think I'm an idiot here, by all means, go take the lower than 66.5 receiving yards on Underdog Fantasy. Chase is at higher lower 66.5 receiving yards. Egbuka's higher lower 64.5. And Underdog Fantasy is available in almost every single state. So instead of screaming at me in the comment section, go to the comment section. You can find the link to Underdog Fantasy. Find it in the description. And when you sign up to Underdog Fantasy with code FLOCK, you are going to get $100 added to your account after you play your first 5. And there are additional promos on top of that, including a Justin Herbert free gimme pick, higher, lower, half a total yard for this weekend. And when you use code FLOCK, not only do you get all those promos, but you'll get free questions for me to answer in the live streams. And I'm going to be streaming every single night until Christmas. Now, looking at Igbuka, he's clearly a smash with no Mike Evans. You've actually seen his targets go up every single week so far this year, going from 6 to 7 to 8 to 10. And now that you have no Bucky Irving as well, there's a chance that they actually increase their passing rate. Don't love the matchup, though, going up against Seattle, especially knowing that you have to travel that distance. Now, our next name is going to be Derrick Henry. Now, very clearly, with no Lamar Jackson, the game plan for the Baltimore Ravens will be run it over and over and over and over again. But realistically, we don't necessarily know if they're going to be able to pick up as many first downs, have as many trips to the red zone. So I would still rather have Lamar Jackson under center for Derrick Henry than not. But the spread on this game is pretty close. It's not like the Texans are supposed to blow out the Ravens. Ashton Jeanty will be our next name. With Ashton Jeanty, he just lost his left tackle, so obviously that is a concern. Right now, he's averaging about 14.8 fantasy points per game, which would mark him as RB15 this season, but coming off a massive performance against the Chicago Bears as RB1, not going to be surprised if we all of a sudden see him more featured in this offense. And in general, I want to be high on the rookie running backs that are steaming up. Cam Skattebo is a running back that I am starting myself either as my RB2 this week. I don't know, RB2 or flex, something like that. But regardless, if I'm looking at Scat, this is a pretty decent matchup playing the New Orleans Saints, where while yes, I would rather the Giants be favored in this game, the spread's only 1.5, so the Giants should actually be able to stay in this and run the ball. The hope is that Jackson Dart with the hamstring injury runs the ball a little bit less himself and has a higher check down rate, and we get Cam Skattebo back closer to what we saw in week 3 where he had 8 targets. Now, Quinshon Judkins will be our next name. Now, obviously, we drafted a ton of Quinshon Judkins in Underdog Best Ball drafts, buying the dip, which I am very happy about. So I love to see Quinshon Judkins dominating, looking like one of the most explosive young running backs in the NFL. But I do want to be honest, it's a really tough matchup here. You're going up against the Minnesota Vikings. You're traveling to Europe. The Vikings have already been there. And if we actually look at the projections with Dylan Gabriel under center, the Cleveland Browns project to be by far and away the worst offense in the league this week, with an implied team total of 15.5 points. That's literally 25% less than what you have with the Cincinnati Bengals. Now, next name will be Xavier Worthy. Xavier Worthy, just an absolute auto start until you get Rashee Rice into this offense. Xavier Worthy is first week back, played 61% of the snaps. Probably would have played more, though, if you actually had a competitive game against the Baltimore Ravens. Courtland Sutton will be our next name. Sutton gives you a very high floor weekly. The one thing that I have a hold up with is this is a very tough matchup going up against the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, I completely understand that everybody is going to be very high on this Broncos offense after what they did against Cincinnati last week. But realistically, you have an implied team total of 20 points here because the matchup's so bad in Philly. So they're projected to score about the same amount of points as the Cincinnati Bengals this week. And I promise you, sportsbooks, they know what they're talking about here. Like Courtland Sutton, higher, lower, 57.5 receiving yards, actually lower than our next name with Tet McMillan. The Panthers offense is supposed to be better than the Broncos offense this week. Tet also gives you the consistent target volume. He's averaging about 9 targets a game. The issue is he hasn't had a single game with over 2 yards per route run. He hasn't had a single game with a receiving touchdown yet. So obviously a lot of this has to fall on the shoulders of Mr. Bryce Young. Jordan Mason will remain a must-start running back. This matchup against the Cleveland Browns isn't great in that the Browns have a good rush defense, but it is good in that the Minnesota Vikings are heavily favored in this game by about 4.5 points. So while last week, Jordan Mason actually had a very bad game script playing against the Steelers where the Vikings trailed the entire time, he still had 19 opportunities, and I'd expect that that's kind of the floor with the usage that we get this next week as well. Now, Alvin Kamara will be our next running back. Alvin Kamara has quietly been horrible this year. Alvin Kamara is averaging 11.88 fantasy points per game, which is good for being the RB27. This matchup against the Giants is one in which the Saints are actually favored in, though, which is going to be a rarity. And honestly, maybe you're a little bit more excited about Kamara this week because of it. Travis Etienne will be in one of my flex spots. Usually who I'm starting is Barkley RB1, Jacobs 2, Scat 3, And then probably like Etienne or I guess Pollard, who's no longer going to be a play if Spears is coming back. But I don't love this spot against the Kansas City Chiefs for Travis Etienne. What I'm really worried about is the fact that the receiving involvement's just gone away entirely. You've only had one reception over the past 2 weeks. And again, if we're looking at the projections going up against KC at the moment, you do have the Chiefs favored by about 4.5 or 3.5 points in this game. So I'm worried that maybe Jacksonville can't run it in the second half. Rachaad White's going to be an auto start for me this week. I mean, I'm assuming that you have no Bucky Irving, of course, but Bucky Irving's on crutches, blah, blah, blah. The last season that we had from Rachaad White before Bucky Irving joined the team was 2023, where Bucky Irving averaged 15.76 fantasy points per game, which was good for the RB10. I mean, in terms of total points that season, he was the RB4 because he was able to stay healthy the entire time with a crazy workload of 272 carries and 70 targets as well. Now, Jakobi Meyers will be our next name. We were way too high on Jakobi Meyers last week. The Raiders offense projected to score a zillion points against the Bears. And obviously, it just all went through Ashton Shinty. This should be a very high-scoring game as well, going up against the Indianapolis Colts. You do have the Colts pretty heavily favored here, so not going to be surprised at all if the Raiders cannot run the ball like they were last week. Now, Jalen Waddle will be our next name. With Jalen Waddle, really strong matchup going up against the Carolina Panthers. Like, realistically, looking at matchups here, I probably need to move Waddle ahead of Jakobi Meyers. If I'm looking at what we have when it comes to the target share expanding, it's going to be very interesting because you really didn't have many targets through the first 4 weeks for Waddle's season, where he has peaked at 6 targets in a game, but this past week, he did have 24% of the targets for the Miami Dolphins because they just didn't throw the ball as much. Now, A.J. Brown will be our next option. With A.J. Brown, he's been horrible. He's the wide receiver 51 in points per game. Like Quentin Johnston on the other side of this is the wide receiver 4. Quentin Johnston is averaging over double the points of A.J. Brown so far this season. Now, that means I'm going to be richer than Bill Gates because I could not stop drafting Quentin Johnston this offseason in Underdog Best Ball drafts, my #1 player. And of course, I'm not going to let you forget it. But realistically, I want to look at the large sample that we have with A.J. Brown. Also, the fact that he's making a lot of noise off the football field. So again, I think that this Super Bowl team is maybe just going to do what they can to go ahead and get him involved a little more. Now, moving over to our next tier, we are going to have Chase Brown leading us off. Again, I do think that this is going to be a little bit of a bounce back spot for the Cincinnati Bengals offense. Now, we can be very honest here in that the Bengals probably aren't going to be able to run the ball a ton against the Detroit Lions because the Lions are about 10-point favorites in this game. What we can also say with it, though, is you actually do have Chase Brown still with the receiving skill set. Chase Brown's averaged about 70% of the snaps for the Cincinnati Bengals this season, while at the same time, he's had 3 targets in at least every single game. So Chase Brown, super exciting. Kenneth Walker will be our next name. Again, we talked about this previously, but the issue that I've had with Kenneth Walker this year in comparison to last season is the target volume's actually fallen dramatically, which, at least for me, I wasn't expecting that, and that is a big surprise. Chuba Hubbard is going to be a player that we have to monitor for sure. Obviously, he's dealing with the calf injury at the moment. Now, I will say, of course, I'm going to be live streaming Saturday night, Sunday morning, answering all your fantasy football questions. I'm going to be live streaming every single day until Christmas, answering your questions and giving you injury updates. So if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel. And if you're already subscribed, drop a like on this video. We are getting this close to hitting 300,000 subscribers, and it would be amazing if we could do that before the season started. Now, Deebo Samuel also dealing with an injury. It's very difficult to rank these two names right now. Deebo's missed back-to-back practices with the heel. That is going to be something that we need to continue to monitor. Now, Chris Olave, you have the guaranteed target volume. You had the receiving touchdown this past week, but against the Giants here, again, it is interesting knowing that this is the first game that we've seen the Saints favored in all season. So maybe this is a game in which the Saints are actually finally going to be able to run the ball. Now, Michael Pittman Jr. will be something we need to monitor if he's going to be good to go or not. But if he is, it's a really good spot for the Indianapolis Colts offense. The Colts project to be one of the highest scoring offenses in the league this week. I think only the Bills and the Lions project to score more points. And clearly, Pittman has established himself as the alpha over Josh Downs in this offense. Now, Ladd McConkey will be our next name. I am going against the projections here with Ladd because Ladd is currently higher, lower 58.5 receiving yards on Underdog, whereas Pittman's higher, lower 51.5. Chris Olave's higher, lower 54.5. It's just tough to get here with Ladd McConkey because we've seen 4 weeks straight now of him being a disappointing name. Like so far this season, he is averaging 8.35 points, which is even worse than A.J. Brown. And again, the reason why I'm willing to give A.J. Brown the benefit of the doubt is he has the name brand appeal where he can make a lot of noise with this team. And I think he can kind of force himself the ball the way that I don't know if Ladd McConkey can do just yet. I think if Quentin Johnson continues to dominate, they're just going to keep on getting it to the big Q. Now, our next name is going to be Marvin Harrison. Marv is averaging 12.2 fantasy points per game so far this season, the wide receiver 28. Against the Tennessee Titans, you actually do have the Cardinals heavily favored. You'd assume that maybe this is a spot in which they're able to just run the ball consistently like what we saw with the Houston Texans last week. But when you have no running backs, there's a chance that you end up getting forced to throw it. Now, Brian Thomas will be our next name. Brian Thomas is averaging 9 points per game this year and is the wide receiver 48. But with this, the target volume's at least there still. He's still averaging about 8 targets a game. And the projections are actually a lot higher on Brian Thomas than where we're ranking him here. He's higher, lower 59.5 receiving yards, which is higher than like the 5 receivers ahead of him. And then our next guy will be Keenan Allen. With Keenan Allen, he did take a small step backwards this past week, but he's still averaging like 17 points per game so far this season. The reason I'm going to have him behind Ladd McConkey and Quentin Johnston is I'm going to assume that the older wide receiver that's in year 10 of his NFL career is maybe going to scale back as time goes on. And also, I don't think you have the same big play appeal with somebody like Keenan Allen as you would do with the big Q. Now, going to Jameson Williams is pretty much all big play appeal and nothing else. But if it's going to happen, it's in a matchup against the Cincinnati Bengals, where the Lions project to score the most points in the league. And obviously, this Bengals offense is absolute garbage. Now, moving over to our next name, we have Zay Flowers. With Flowers, typically a lot higher, but I don't know what we can say about this offense with no Lamar Jackson. Typically, the Ravens project to be a top 3 scoring offense on the week. Now they have an implied team total of 17 points. So I'm going to be a lot more concerned with Zay. Our next name will be J.K. Dobbins. I still believe that J.K. Dobbins is the starting running back in Denver. My hesitation with them is this is just a really tough matchup going up against the Philadelphia Eagles. And Dobbins isn't a great receiving back either. So realistically, if the receiving usage isn't there and they're trailing in this game, it could get ugly. Tony Pollard will be our next running back. Tony Pollard, I honestly, and I'm embarrassed to admit this out loud because he's been horrible, right? I mean, this dude at the moment is the RB29, averaging 10.4 fantasy points per game. But I would move Tony Pollard up to the very top of this tier if Tajee Spears doesn't play. If Spears plays, I'm going to have to move Tony Pollard down. But right now for my own team, since I have Josh Jacobs and DK Metcalf on bye, I have a decision of who I'm going to be playing in the flex, whether that comes to Tony Pollard, Stephon Diggs, or Jerry Jeudy. Right now, I am leaning on Tony Pollard. Actually, I have to bench one of those 3 players, and I'm definitely going to play Tony Pollard over him. Now, Woody Marks is our next option. Woody Marks clearly looks like he's a much better running back than Tony Pollard at this point of his career. He's in a much better offense. He has a really good matchup, and he just had 58% of the snaps for the Houston Texans. So you'd really want to say like, oh yeah, Woody Marks is taking over as the starting running back here in Houston, which you can tell that's how I'm ranking it. But it can't hurt to see just one more week because it's not like Nick Chubb was completely removed from this offense. Last week, Chubb did still have 15 opportunities, and it was obviously a blowout against the Tennessee Titans, so it's difficult to take too much away from it. But if Woody Marks cements himself as a starter one more weekend, then obviously we can move him up even higher. Now, Chris Godwin is way higher in our rankings this week than he was last week. A lot of reasons. 1, injuries. 2, bye weeks. And 3, because while, yeah, he only scored about 5.5 points last week, the man played 80% of the snaps. He had 10 targets and he ran 38 routes. He ran just as many routes as what you had with Igbuka. So, like, I think Godwin's back to being a full-time player. Again, I don't think he's at full-time effectiveness. I'm going to still rank him well below Igbuka, despite Godwin being the wide receiver 2 in points per game last season. But he's going to climb this list sooner rather than later. Devonta Smith will be our next name. Drafted him in a lot of Underdog best ball drafts. Not looking good because the Philadelphia Eagles refused to throw the ball. But the spread on this game's like 3.5 points, so maybe it's one in which Philly does have to throw it. David Montgomery will be our next name. With Montgomery, boom bust option. If he scores a touchdown, it'll be great. If he doesn't score a touchdown, it's not so much. Because obviously you do have Jahmyr Gibbs leading this backfield. But with that being said, David Montgomery's in a spot in which you are in the highest scoring offense of the week projections wise. You have a great matchup against the Cincinnati Bengals where freaking RJ Harvey ran all over him last week in garbage time. Now, Michael Carter is going to be our next player. I know that's crazy to say because Michael Carter was just on the practice squad. But what the announcements out of Arizona are is it is trending towards Michael Carter being the starting running back in Arizona. Now, if I knew that was 100% going to be the case, then I would go ahead and I would move Michael Carter up a tier. But there is some uncertainty here. DeMercado could definitely be the guy. But realistically, I expect it to be a running back by committee where Carter probably has the majority of it. Now, our next player is going to be Wan'Dale Robinson. Wan'Dale Robinson, safe target volume with no Malik Neighbors. Again, I don't necessarily think that Jackson Dart's ever going to go out there and have 400 passing yards like we saw from Russ early on because Jackson Dart's going to run the ball himself. T. Higgins will be our next name. If we're looking at Higgins, it's a garbage offense, but they're going to have to throw the ball a ton against Detroit. Should be a really high scoring game. And hell, I have to start this dude at wide receiver. So send up a prayer that we somehow survive and move on to being 5-0 and stay as the only undefeated team in the league. Now looking at Jordan Addison. Addison had the big play last week. This matchup against the Cleveland Browns is one in which I would want to avoid starting any wide receivers if I could, though, because again, it has like by far and away the lowest over-under of any game we've seen really this season. And I can say the same thing here with Jerry Jeudy. So I would love your opinion of this. Who would you start between Jerry Jeudy and Stephon Diggs? Like we're going to have Jeudy, Shakir, Diggs all here. I have to make this decision for my own team. My thought process in ranking Jerry Jeudy over Stephon Diggs at the moment is Judy's given you very consistent target volume so far this year, where he is averaging about 7-8 targets a game. And now that you have no Cedric Tillman, the target should just be even that much more consistent. Now, the efficiency obviously is horrendous with Jeudy, partly his fault, mainly quarterback, mainly offense. Going over and looking at what we have with Shakir, he's averaging like 5 targets a game. Stephon Diggs, he is expanding his role. And obviously the Patriots are heavily outmatched here by Buffalo. So they should have to throw the ball in the second half. Now, going over to our next tier, Alec Ayomanor may end up being my favorite pick'em on Underdog this week, where he is higher, lower, 38.5 receiving yards. I think that spot will be very interesting to take the higher if you actually have Calvin Ridley not practicing again on Friday. Because if that is the case, then Alec Ayomanor will really be the only weapon here for Cam Ward. And he has been averaging 6-7 targets a game so far this season. Now, Darius Slayton will be our next name. Darius Slayton get the massive bump up with no Malik Neighbors, but I view him as a boom bust option. Realistically, anybody in these last two tiers, if you have to start them, GG's, wrap it up. Cooper Kupp, maybe. Charbonnet is going to have the ball. Some. Ramondre Stevenson, Trevion Henderson. I want to rank Henderson ahead of Ramondre, but it's just so difficult when Ramondre still has the workload. But, I mean, they're like 9-point dogs in this game against Buffalo. I don't really want to have them in my lineup. Nick Chubb, our next name, looks like he has no upside and lost a job to Woody Marks. Ja'Cory Cross-Merritt gets to touch the ball 7 times a game. RJ Harvey, still the backup in a very tough matchup. Isaiah Pacheco, the worst player in football. Keon Coleman, boom bust name. Josh Downs, a most overhyped guy from fantasy football Twitter this offseason. Dermicado, maybe you have a shot that he's the starter and we're wrong about Michael Carter. And then Travis Hunter, just because we have to at least say his name in every video. But I really appreciate you and really hope I was able to help you out in some way with this tier list. And again, my favorite pick 'em on Underdog is looking like it's going to be Alec Ayomanor to go higher than 38.5 receiving yards, assuming we have no Calvin Ridley practice. He's hit 38 receiving yards in 3 straight games, and that's with the Tennessee Titans being horrendous. I don't think their offense is getting much worse from how it's been. And you can find that link to Underdog Fantasy in the description and comment section. And again, Underdog Fantasy is the best offer that they've ever had right now for new users. And that's use code FLOCK when you sign up. And after you play your first $5, you're going to get $100 added to your account. Plus, you'll get free questions that you can ask me on the live streams. Plus, you'll get a free Justin Herbert pick, more than less than half a total yard for this weekend. And I'm going to leave that link in the description, comment section. Underdog is available in almost every state. But I really appreciate you, and I really hope I get to see you out in the live stream later tonight so I can answer your questions then.